Okay, good morning or afternoon, as the time may be with your time zones, and welcome to our side event on Crisis and Corrections, Indigenous Peoples and the Canadian Prison System, hosted by the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. My name is Bradley Cooper, and I'm the National Youth Representative for the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. I'm proud to be participating as the moderator for today's side event. I would first like to begin by giving recognition to the ancestral homeland of the Algonquin people, in which this presentation slide has been prepared. Today's presentation will focus on Canada's treatment of non-status and off-reserve Indigenous peoples in the justice and corrections systems. I believe you will find this topic very insightful and will gain new perspectives on these topics by the end of the presentation. We are hosting this event virtually at the Permanent Forum for the second year in a row. We hope those joining us stay safe and healthy during what is a difficult time for many of us as a result of the pandemic. I would like to make a few technical notes to ensure participants have the opportunity to contribute when the schedule allows. First, this webinar is being recorded. Secondly, there will be an opportunity at the end of the presentation for any comments or questions. If you'd like to ask a question live, please click on the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen. I'll advise you when it is your turn to ask questions. When I call upon you, you'll be prompted by the host to unmute. Please unmute at that time and you will be free to ask your questions. You may also use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens to ask questions. You can submit your questions either as yourself or anonymously as you prefer. And as I begin, I want to take a moment to recognize today's Red Dress Day here in Canada. This is a National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Today, we honor our grandmothers, mothers, daughters, sisters, aunties, cousins, friends, and two-spirited and LGBTQIA+ people who have gone missing or have been murdered, the survivors of gender and race-based violence, and their families and friends whose lives have been ever altered because of their impacts. In our work on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, CAP envisions a transformed Canada where Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited, and LGBTQIA+ people are safe, secure, honored, respected, and treated equitably, regardless of status or location. And now I would like to introduce our presenters here today. They are all members of our community and have very much important information to share on this topic. First, I'd like to introduce our National Elder Representative, Diane Langley, who will be providing us with an opening prayer today. Next, I will introduce our National Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Elmer St. Pierre, who will provide us with welcoming remarks and an overview of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples and our constituency. Following is National Vice Chief, Kim Bodan, who will be providing a presentation on the correction system and the Indigenous experience in Canada. Following our National Vice Chief, we will open up to our panelist members, including President Beverly Allard from the Indigenous Congress Alberta Association, as well as National Vice Chief Bowden, who will also serve on the panel. Towards the end of the presentation, again, we'll open up an opportunity for anyone who wishes to ask any questions for our panel members. And so, following the introductions, I would now like to open up an invitation for our National Elder Representative, Diane Langley, to offer a prayer and to get us started in a good way. National Elder?
Yes, Quay, welcome. First, I would like to send a thank you to the different peoples for allowing us to meet in this way from their unceded territories. Second, I would like to offer a virtual tobacco pouch for everyone on this call for strength and help for our people. Oh, great Spirit, we, your people, ask that you guide us as we again enter into discussions that we hope will help us make positive changes wherever required. We ask your guidance to let us make headway for what we are trying to accomplish. We ask you to let it be so. Tahoe. Walari. Thank you.
Tahoe, Wallen. Thank you, National Elder. Now, I would like to open the invitation to our National Chief, Elmer St. Pierre, who will provide opening remarks, set the context for our discussion today, and provide a presentation in our community. As a community-dedicated leader, National Chief St. Pierre has much insight to share with all of us about the non-status, Métis, and off-reserve Indigenous peoples. National Chief.
Thank you very much, Bradley, and thank everybody else for being here. Like Bradley said, this is going to be a very interesting meeting, how things are being treated here in Canada, our Aboriginal people. I'd like to thank Diane, our Elder Diane Langley, for her opening prayers and starting us off in a good way. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the territory and the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people, where I join you today here in Ottawa. I also want to acknowledge all the territories each of you are from. My name is Yelmer St. Pierre. I'm the National Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal People, or CAP. I was elected as the National Chief in 2020 on the promise of representing our grassroots people. One of the most fundamental issues that is important to us is justice and helping pave a better path for our people and our community. We will speak today about the crisis happening in Canada today. We will hear from our National Vice Chief, Kim Bodin, and our community leaders about our broken justice system. Before we begin with the presentation, I would like to tell you about CAP and our communities. All the Indigenous people will experience the highest quality of life founded and rebuilding of our nation. Our Indigenous citizens will be rightfully treated with respect, dignity, integrity, and equality. CAP is one of 5 national organizations, Aboriginal organizations in Canada. We were founded in 1971 as the Native Council of Canada, before coming the Congress of Aboriginal People in 1993. CAP is the national voice of off-reserve status and non-status Indians, Métis, and Southern Inuits. Throughout its history, CAP has been committed to addressing injustice to our people. We serve as a national voice for our 11 provincial territory organizations from British Columbia in the west coast to Labrador in the east coast. Throughout our history, CAP has been fighting to address the Indian Act and other practices that have led to the exclusion of our people. CAP is responsible for the Cap Daniel decision, a 17-year-old legal battle fight. This confirms that the Métis non-status people are Aboriginal under the Constitution. Our people have too long faced unfairness and hardship on the basis of their identity. This is because of a wrong and damaging belief that they are less Aboriginal than their brothers and sisters on reserve. Tragically, the government has been treating us this way, and we are unable to access the rights as Aboriginal people. Thank you for joining us today. I'll turn this back over to Bradley, introducing our speakers. Thank you, Miigwech Nameki.
Thank you, National Chief. I'm constantly amazed at the work that the Congress has been able to accomplish for its people with so much adversity. To build on what you've already mentioned, I'd like to expand on that. The focus of CAP's work is to address the needs for the off-reserve Indigenous peoples to access the rights, programming, and services that they need, especially for the rapidly growing Indigenous population residing in most urban communities across Canada. Our policies at CAP focus on the real practical issues facing local Indigenous communities, such as health, justice, opportunities for youth, housing, and the environment. CAP has always demanded for the recognition of non-status and off-reserve Métis and Southern Inuit rights, as outlined in the Constitution of Canada, as well as the needs for equitable resourcing and programming to address their day-to-day needs. Something, as National Chief has mentioned, was eventually confirmed by Canada's highest court. This lack of recognition resulting in the Daniel decision has left our people out of much consultation and engagement and placed us in an even more vulnerable position by creating all Indigenous policies with a distinctions-based lens that excludes our people. Creating these distinctions has created barriers to our people getting essential services in child welfare, healthcare, education, and many other areas. It cannot be understated, and I hope everyone will agree, that a change in this approach is definitely needed for the best interest of all Indigenous peoples in Canada and across the world. One other important area communities certainly face crisis in is in our justice and correction system, the topic of today's side event. Despite the alarming statistics reported, Canada continues to ignore the needs of our communities. But of course, I'm not the expert to speak on this subject, which is why this time we have the pleasure of hearing from our National Vice Chief, Kevin Baudin, who I will invite to speak on what's happening in Canada's correction system and how it needs to be improved. National Vice Chief, welcome and thanks for being with us today. We look forward to your presentation. National Vice Chief, if you present.
Good morning, everybody. Tansei. Thank you, Elder Diane, for those opening prayer and starting us off in a good way. As Bradley said, my name is Kimberly Bowden. I'm the National Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. I come from you from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon. Now, as what our chief said, National Chief Elmer St. Pierre said, our vision of CAP is a recognition of our rights and rebuilding of our nations. This is the only pathway to full and equal participation of our constituents in Canadian and global society. Across Canada, 80% of Indigenous people live off reserve and 44% live in urban areas across the country. These are our constituents, and we fight to ensure their rights are understood and respected. Any solution that does not include our people is no solution at all. We recognize that Canada is a colonial government. The policies of Canada so far has been to reduce the number of Indigenous people that are recognized and acknowledged and affirmed. This has not changed. A decolonizing justice system must acknowledge that non-status off-reserve and urban Indigenous populations to be effective, or it is nothing more than symbolic. As our former leader, Harry Daniels, said, we know who we are. No policy or law can erase heritage and nationhood, no matter where we live or whether the government acknowledges that identity. It is rooted in treaties, Section 35 and 9124 of Canada's Constitution. The criminalization of our people. Indigenous people continue to be criminalized and marginalized in Canada. Colonial policies are the cause. The solution of recognition of rights, self-determination through a relationship between peoples based on equality and respect. Indigenous people make up 5% of Canada's overall population. 10 years ago, 20% of federal inmates were Indigenous. Today, that percentage is 32 and continues to rise. As of today, 50% of Indigenous women make up the federal incarceration rate in our federal prisons in Canada. That's a 20% increase in the last 5 years. Today, they are held by colonial government despite the right to own legal traditions under UNDRIP. Nations have the ability to transfer prisoners to be taken into care of their own domestic justice systems. This is not the case in Canada. Internationally, CAP has lobbied for Indigenous women. One example is Sharman Smith, who's sitting in Turkey, where she's been currently held for the last 8 years, and she still can't get home. The government has outright ignored us, CAP, as we advocate for it, and left her to rot in Turkey. Domestically, we face barriers to Indigenous inmates being transferred into Indigenous justice systems that are culturally appropriate and effective. These barriers are political decisions by colonial governments to deprive our communities of their rights. I believe that Indigenous inmates are political prisoners because of the colonial policies that treat Indigenous people more harshly. Our inmates are more likely to be put in maximum security, to be involved in use of force incidents, and to be placed in segregation. The government has changed the name to these structural intervention units, that's what they call them today, but our people still spend the most time locked up and isolated. Another reality, compared to other prison populations, Indigenous inmates are released much later and have their release revoked more often, even though they enter rehab programs more quickly and complete them at higher rates than other prisoners. We see discrimination at every stage of the justice system because it is not an Indigenous justice system, but a colonial system to control and suppress Indigenous identity and their connections to communities. Throughout COVID-19, Indigenous inmates were most likely to contact the virus and more likely to be hospitalized. Non-Indigenous, non-status off-reserve and urban communities lack the resources to act in fundamental basic rights. Our communities have less access to sentencing circles, restorative justice, healing lodges, and other traditional justice measures. The government must go beyond the narrow strategies that they failed to address the structural problems and ensure that our communities have the resources for true self-determination. Now, I'm going to speak about a few topics today to highlight the major crises of our people that face in Canada today, including policing, mental health, women, and in children. For example, in policing, the introduction to policing is an introduction to Canada's justice system, police brutality. In order to tell a story about how policing is a major issue for Indigenous people in Canada, I'm going to share some pictures with you. I want to provide a warning because the content may be disturbing viewers due to troubling images and subject matter. If you think this may affect you, please take a safety measure such as leaving the room or turning off your screen. The problem for Indigenous overrepresentation of Canada's corrections starts long before they are behind bars. There is systemic racism and discrimination in Canada's policing. Indigenous people are racially profiled by police and more likely to be carted and stopped by police without any cause. They're more likely to experience confrontation with the police and victims of police violence at a much higher rate. Have you ever heard of Starlight Tours? This was a tactic used in Saskatchewan. Starlight Tours were Indigenous men and women, sometimes intoxicated, were taken to the outskirts of the city in sub-zero temperatures and abandoned. This is a policy that had dramatic effects for our people. They often had their clothing taken away, making it extremely dangerous. Temperatures of minus 40, 50 degrees, as well as these men suffered injuries. In some cases, they lost their life, never to be seen again. I'm not convinced that Starlight Tours or similar practices don't happen today. The police abuse is not only found in Starlight Tours. I get calls from Indigenous people all the time who have suffered from interactions with the police. I'm going to tell you this story about Percy Dumas of Edmonton. Now, we do have a picture of Percy there. Percy, on the left-hand side, was he was from Edmonton. He was about 18 years old. As you can see, there was a domestic issue in Edmonton, and when the police arrived, two officers, they asked him and his brother when they came down the stairs to basically give themselves up, and they weren't even sure what was going on. So they laid on the ground and hands behind their back, and one of the officers decided to kick Percy in the head. That officer today is still working, and you can see the damages. I just found out recently as well that his brother, as a result of the incident and his interaction with the police and suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, that he committed suicide. So, to say that there's no implications to what the police do would certainly be an understatement. As you can see, based on the pictures, what's going on in our justice system. On the right-hand side, an issue there. There's a woman from Manitoba, an Indigenous woman, and the injuries that you see are caused from a police dog that decided to attack her. And I can tell you today that same police dog is still working today, and they've attacked other people as well and left those kind of injuries. It's pretty bad. Now, in terms of like carding and racial profiling has a devastating impact on the lives of too many Indigenous people in Canada and the harms to our communities in the process. I would like to be hard pressed to find an Indigenous person and community who actually trusts the police. How can we be expected to help when we're in trouble if the people who are supposed to help us and protect us are often the ones who are harming us? Police forces in Canada need to make serious changes to their systems to improve the lives and outcomes of our people. I believe that they can do that they are the gateway to our prisons. They can do something. We cannot expect to reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in our prisons if police continue to scoop us up and charge us with at such an alarming rate. This would include such issues as jaywalking or not having a bell on your bike and being thrown in prison as a result of that. Mental health issues. Once in the system, the situation does not get any better. The correction system in Canada does not significantly support Indigenous inmates when it comes to mental health. I hear from inmates all the time that are locked up in segregation longer than legally allowed. I hear the abuse that they receive at the hands of correctional guards. I hear about the lack of services and supports to help with mental health challenges and about people dying by suicide. Outside of corrections, our communities suffer high rates of suicide, especially with regards to our youth. In 2017, parliamentary report found that suicide rates amongst Indigenous people, especially youth, both female and male, were as much as 40% higher than among the non-Indigenous population. While the suicide rate in Canada's population has declined, the rates amongst Indigenous people have increased over the past 3 decades. Those rates don't decrease in our inmates. Too often, Indigenous offenders are found to have taken their own lives and be found dead of unnatural causes. CAP has fought on their behalf to bring their cases to light and ensure that they are pardoned and returned to their communities and families. There were residential school survivors who immediately sent to jail for being falsely convicted of murder. The pathways to prison and marginalization start from childhood. Our children. I'm going to speak a bit about our children and child welfare system for a few moments. Indigenous children in Canada are more likely to become involved in the criminal justice system than to graduate from high school. This is not because they are more likely to commit crimes, but rather because of systemic issues such as poverty and racism and discrimination. Indigenous children are removed from their family homes at a higher rate, abused and murdered while in the care at a higher rate, and face homelessness and criminalization at a higher rate. The colonial child welfare system continues to act as an outgrowth of the same ideas that were built Canada's residential school. I call this Canada's pipeline to our prisons and jails in Canada. Indigenous children make up only 7% of the child population in Canada, yet stats show that 52% of our children in foster care are Indigenous. Here's a regional example. Manitoba has the highest child apprehension rate in Canada, with over 11,000 children in child and family services, or 90% of them are Indigenous. Despite lawsuits with multi-billion-dollar settlements highlighting the abuse of children in care, off-reserve and non-status children continue to be ignored and sidelined. Métis people who were taken in the 60s scoop continue to be ignored. CAP has seen our communities excluded from the Indigenous child welfare legislation drafted by Canada's government. The result of exclusion of lack of funding and powers to oversee child welfare services. Child abusers do not get checked for status card. Neither do police racially profiling Indigenous people. Neither do employees denying jobs and landlords denying housing. Denying education, justice, and child welfare services on the lack of certain documents detains youth to a pathway out of the child welfare system jail pipeline. CAP has been urging the government of Canada to implement the Cap Daniels Supreme Court decision. Without international pressure, we face continued delays and refusal to acknowledge the rights of our communities. We call on the international community to support the full inclusion of all Indigenous people in Canadian policies. And in conclusion, I want to stress that the government of Canada can no longer ignore the crisis happening in the correctional system in Canada. Stats do not lie. The problems have been exposed for many, many years and seem to only be getting worse. Canada needs to step up and address major systemic problems of policing, to courts, to prisons and parole. The need to work with our Indigenous communities to strengthen the supports and ensure better outcomes for our people. We need community-based solutions grounded in culture and traditions. I fear that within 10 years, Indigenous people will make up more than 50% of inmates in Canada federally incarcerated. What will it take to get government attention? I want to thank you for listening, and miigwech. I will turn it back to Bradley.
Thank you, National Police Chief Bowden, for that very interesting presentation. I'm amazed at those numbers and sadly not surprised to hear what our people are going through. This is an urgent need for government to take action on this. I would now like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. As you have heard and seen from today is our National Vice Chief, Kimberly Bowden. Also joining him will be President Beverly Allard of the Indigenous Congress of Alberta Association. So I'll now open up to panel discussion. I do have some prepared questions for our panelists. For the participants who are in the audience, I encourage you to write in your own questions or prepare your own questions for the question and answer period following this panel. So welcome, National Vice Chief Kim and President Beverly. So my first question for the both of you and our prepared list of questions is certainly we've heard that there's a lack of programming within Canada that helps keep inmates corrected to their communities and culture to improve their outcomes upon release. Do either of you have experience with a program like this within your community, and how did it serve or not serve your community?
Yes, so first of all, I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you very much. I am coming today as well from the Treaty 6 territory within the Edmonton region. We are home to the Nihiawak, the Anishinaabe, Niitsitapi, the Métis, Dene, and these Kanakota Sioux. So within the Edmonton region, there has been a program based on a restorative justice model here that provides supports and access to resources for youth and individuals either coming from the youth juvenile system or from the correctional system to integrate back into society. But one of the things that we found in making this as effective as it has been is that there's always been a longstanding need for wraparound services. And by that, I mean intervention and supports to assist the individual in addressing issues of mental health, in addressing issues of housing, of employment, and by way of doing that, really addressing all four aspects of our medicine wheel. So ensuring that the physical, the mental, the emotional, and spiritual needs of that individual are taken care of, and that they have opportunity to access the resources and supports they need. So the unfortunate part of such services like that is the requirement for funding. Because wraparound services do tend to be more costly, it's really important that we have all levels of government in providing support for the development of those programs, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal. And I think that there's not enough funding support for things like that. But again, you know, within this region, this is one of the areas that we're really working to push forward and to address and make sure that more folks have opportunity to access.
Thank you, President Allard, for your comments. National Vice Chief Kim, would you like to add on to what was stated?
I would. The probably the number one issue in terms of Indigenous people who are feeling the impact of the Correctional Services Canada and the prison system would be the lack of programs. There's been many discussions I've had with people who've been released, we'll say between 5 and 10 years out of prison, the number one thing they tell me is that they didn't receive any programs within Correctional Services Canada. Like they got zero help, zero anything. They'd be lucky if they participated in one program. We know Indigenous programs work inside, and we can get to our people and we can address a number of these issues that that have impacted them to why they ended up in there. It makes a huge difference. It makes a big difference in their lives, and it's really frustrating because when you got last year alone, Correction Services Canada had a $3.1 billion budget. And what I find with correction services as well is they operate like their own independent little country. So all your rights, human rights, treaty rights, Section 35 rights, Daniels rights, all of that's gone. There's no such thing when you enter the system. So when you have a lack of programming internally, it's going to make a difference. Even the interaction with our elders as well is very limited. Today, for example, there's been a drawdown in terms of prisoners. For example, it peaked around just over 14,000. Today, it's at 12,500. And based on a conversation that we had with the investigator, we found out, the ombudsman, we found out that they, in essence, could close 2 prisons if they wanted to, but they continue to employ, I don't know, the number is stunning. It is over 14,000 employees. So basically you have one employee to less than one prisoner. Today, this prisoner stats is sitting at 12,500. And I mentioned earlier too, that we have a massive increase of Indigenous women. Like we have healing lodges. The Eagle Women's Healing Lodge in Winnipeg, for example. I had an opportunity to go there and it was only at about 30% capacity. And the biggest reason is that they put our people at such a high level of security, usually high level security. There's no such thing to them as medium or low level. They can't, so you have to, there's such a bar, it's so high that you can't attain that bar to even get into that facility. So we know something's wrong. Everybody knows, the term industry, probably heard that. Indigenous people, if anybody who's been involved in justice system looks at it that way, who advocates for their people in their communities, see that the Canadian government, including the provinces as well, look at Indigenous people as an industry. And if we take ownership of that those program initiatives and that's going to end. That's not something that they're too excited about. So there's just many, many examples, and there's no way that you should be able to go through a system for years and years and not have one program. There's just no way, but it happens all the time. So anyways, that's programming in on that part. Maybe Beverly will add some more too.
Well, I was just going to say, what I can do is talk a little bit about what we as CAP are currently doing.
Yes.
So on December, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice today. I don't know what's going on. So back in December of 2018, the Government of Canada and the Congress of Aboriginal People entered into a political accord. So assigned by the Minister of Indigenous Relations and the National Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal People. And the accord, above all else, created the opportunity to establish and to move forward in building this strong working relationship between CAP and Canada. And then from this, to address the rights, the needs, and the interests of off-reserve Indigenous people across Canada. So to provide an opportunity for the Government of Canada and the Congress of Aboriginal People to discuss and advance joint policy priorities and address the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, the CAP Canada Policy Table on Justice was created. So along with our partners, the Department of Justice, Correction Service Canada, and Public Safety Canada, we also have representation on those tables from our elder, from the CAP Elders Council, and a youth representative from our National Youth Council. So at this table, we work collaboratively to identify opportunities and to develop, timely policy, programming, and legislative responses in the area of justice. And these are all guided by the Daniels decision. So in creating policies, our hope is that we will be able to allow greater inclusion in all facets of the criminal justice system in terms of our voice, and work to redress the inequalities experienced by off-reserve status and non-status, Nunatukevat Inuit, and Métis people. Also contributing to the development of a national Indigenous justice strategy, reviewing issues of restorative justice, and advocating for continued development of Indigenous-led justice programs that will provide alternatives to mainstream approaches, promoting cross-jurisdictional strategy development for the establishment of national standards in the writing of GLADU reports, which we know are critically important. These are all but some of the issues that our table is currently working to address. And, the problems associated with the issues of justice as it relates to the Indigenous population here in Canada are very well documented. And as we all know that, the concept of justice as a policy piece is really broad. So with this in mind, CAP also convened a separate Justice Council or committee, which acts as an advisor then to the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples Board of Directors on matters relating to Indigenous people involved in and impacted by both federal and provincial correctional and jurisdictional or judicial systems. So as indicated by, the several issues that were raised here by the National Vice Chief, the need for strong advocacy is critical in ensuring our people are adequately and wholly represented in all facets of the judicial, the correctional, and the restorative sectors of justice. In March of 2020, CAP developed a political platform paper, which stated that too many Indigenous people in prison, and we know approximately 32% of the federal prison population right now are of Indigenous ancestry, despite accounting for less than 5% of the total population in Canada. Incidents of police violence, over-policing, as Indigenous people are more likely to be arrested and more likely to receive stiffer sentences. We have a disproportionate number of Indigenous victims of violence. And, today, as Bradley mentioned in the opening, today is the National Day of Recognition for the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, men, and boys. We have over-institutionalization, again, from children in care right through to the prison population. We have participation in gangs. All of these issues are very well documented, and these are the things which really impact and fragment our Indigenous communities everywhere. The causes of these outcomes, as described by our National Vice Chief, are also well documented. We know that there exists an extensive history of racism and discriminatory behavior towards Indigenous people, that there's oppressive colonial practices ongoing, assimilation policies that erode culture, language, values, and identity. We struggle with poverty, a lack of focus on prevention, restorative and traditional justice, and we have very minimal supports for offenders when reintegrating into society. So all of these things contribute to the crisis that we're facing. And these, again, are all issues that require a real critical oversight, coordinated effort, and certainly a great deal of reform. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, President Allard. That's great information to hear being shared. So for my next question, this is directed for our National Vice Chief, Kim Boden. You mentioned the concept of pathways to prison in your presentation, as well as the concept of how marginalization begins from childhood. Could Could you speak a little more to what you meant by those two phrases?
Sure. The foster care system has, been alluded to many times as a pipeline to prisons and jails. What happens is when you're involved in that system and you become a product of that system, then you tend to, you tend to become, in terms of poverty will affect you, relationships. You get into domestic issues in terms of the relationships that you pick. The other thing that's really big as well is that when you graduate, well, I don't use the term graduate, but when you age out at the age of 18, any programs or any assistance, resources, it's all gone. They just completely forget about you and you're left to your own. So meanwhile, the system scoops you up, takes you out of, away from your families and your supports and all that. Even other supports, it's gone. Then they just tell you, okay, well, you're on your own, you can fend for yourself. And so what happens? Of course, unfortunately, you end up in the justice system. And then, of course, it's a one-way train. And that's what I meant. We could do report after report on that particular issue. It's unbelievable what happens there. And we've all heard it. We know the stories. Community people who are based on, in their communities, that grassroots people, they know this is happening on a daily basis, including the policy people with the federal government as well. They recognize that, but they, again, they don't do a whole lot. I wanted to add a couple of context to this story as well, in terms of other things. When Harper came into power, he really changed the landscape of justice in Canada. And he had a serious focus on Indigenous people in his country. He probably set us back 30, 40 years. And today we're still paying that price of Harper policies that he put together within the justice system. And I'm going to give you a number. The Conservatives, when they made all these changes, they put an extra $2 billion into the system so that they could follow those very tough on crime agenda issues, tough on Indigenous people issues that they wanted to strive for. It was a big, and they mirror a lot of what's going on in the United States. 3-strike rule kind of thing, you're out. They won't say that, but that's exactly what's going on. It's horrible. When you have people, like I'm dealing with a guy right now he's been on remand for 9 years, federally held on remand. He's been on remand for 9 years. They're trying to deal him for one charge, dangerous offender designation. They want to put that on him for one charge that happened 9 years ago. And all of a sudden how could that happen? Those dangerous offender designations are a clear example of a policy implemented by Harper, demonizing people with there's no roadmap or a ramp to get out of that process. Once you're in that system, once you get designated or they're targeted, you are in serious trouble. You'll be tied up for the system for the rest of your life. And they do that to Indigenous men and women. One of the examples that I want to, and I've had discussions with Correction Services Canada about this, is the issue of Section 810 of the Criminal Code. They're called peace bonds. So Correction Services Canada, a lot of times they fail to do their job in terms of offering supports or resources to somebody when they are released. So they won't provide them an opportunity for early release. Then they wait to the 11th hour, almost literally the day before that they're released, and they'll present them with a Section 810 and say, we want you to sign this thing. In essence, what it does is it puts you on parole for another year to possibly 2 years on the outside with no resources, no assistance. And a lot of times they don't even have a place to go to. They're couch surfing or they're living on the street. That's what they do. And then they expect you to survive and adhere to Section 810. And I just want to be clear. Some people, there's two kinds of Section 810 they're called peace bonds. One is relation to if domestic issues, husband and wife or your partner, that kind of thing. But the other one that they use it's called point 2 And point 2 is the one where you refer to where the Correction Services Canada gets the police in Canada, it doesn't matter whether it's RCMP or municipal, to implement that, and they ask them to follow you. So they'll say, get this guy to sign this paper, and we're going to follow them for the next year. Then they put conditions in there that you have a hard time adhering to. And what I mean by that, if you have addiction issues and you haven't got help for that, jails and prisons are not addiction facilities. They're not treatment centers. So they think that magically all your problems are addressed once you get out of prison or jail, and that's not true at all. But that's what they think. So they'll put on there in a condition, well, you can't drink. But if you have an alcohol problem and you had one going in, okay, where does that get you? So instead of saying, well, you know what, we're going to send you to a treatment center, no, they're going to send you back to jail. Once you sign that piece of paper, you go back to jail for a year and sometimes longer for just having a problem with addiction. So this is what goes on. This is reality. Now, granted, I've had many discussions with Correction Services Canada about this as well. We disagree on a lot of things, and that's certainly one of them. We know that they implement those policies, and it's when you hear stories about are people being dropped off if you have a gambling issue, for example, at a casino, in a bus, that's what happens. They do that, and they'll give you $50. Well, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to go to the casino, and what do you think is going to happen? Duh. So anyways, these are the kind of things that we need to work on. And one thing too is that these resources are not reaching our communities all across this country. The kind of money that they spend should be reaching our grassroots people, our agencies, and I'm talking Indigenous, not non-Indigenous. I'm talking about Indigenous. There's thousands of non-Indigenous organizations out there doing programs for our people when they get out of prison and that. I'm talking about grassroots people, period. That's, in terms of Indigenous people and organizations across Canada, like our affiliates, for example, that's who should be running these programs, not, whatever in BC somewhere, a church organization, for example. I'll give you that for an example. So that's what's going on when you have, like I said, when the resources, and they'll tell you that they're stretched. $3.1 billion budget is stretched. 5% of that budget is what is allocated for community programming. 5% of 3.1 billion. So that tells you where the priorities are. So anyways, I know I go on and on about it. I could go on and on for hours on end.
Thank you, National Vice Chief, for sharing. I think it's very clear and obvious to everyone here that this is a topic very near and dear to your heart. We appreciate the passion, experience, and work effort you bring to addressing this vitally important topic. So my next question for our other panelist, President Allard, we do understand that overrepresentation is definitely an impact within Canada, as we've heard through the presentation. I'd like to be able to hear from your perspective, what do you believe are some steps that Canada can do to improve the situation of overrepresentation and improve the outcomes for Indigenous people in Canada who go through the criminal justice system?
Okay, I just need to make sure my mic is off. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we know the Truth and Reconciliation Commission included 18 calls to action, and these were related to justice. And then the inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls also included like 25 specific calls to justice. But despite these calls being raised as priority issues of impact on CAP's missing and murdered Indigenous women's table, our housing table, our family programming table, most of the initiatives developed to date that address the TRC and the MMIWG recommendations are conducted without the full participation of CAP. So this means that the unique needs of off-reserve Indigenous people, so those impacting the social determinants of health, like higher crime rates in urban areas and lack of cultural supports, community supports, and increased policing, related issues, those sort of things. Those discussions, without the inclusion of CAP, are not fulsomely considered in the overall picture. It also means that a lot of decisions that arise out of those discussions will be implemented without the benefit of having CAP's input. So, at the present time, the Canadian government, in its effort to give recognition to who they see as the distinct representative governing bodies of all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people, has identified a model or approach to the designation of funding currently, and this is currently referred to as Canada's distinctions-based approach. Unfortunately, CAP, as a national Indigenous organization of Canada, we're not recognized within this model. And it is this model that influences funding accessibility and our opportunity to be included in a more substantive manner in respect to critical discussions impacting justice. So as I'm sure many of our panel or attendees here today would know, Article 18 of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states very clearly that Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making in matters that would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions. So recognizing that many of the issues impacting CAP's constituents are intrinsically related to this right, and that it's a priority of CAP to collaborate where they're able to, and to develop policies and approaches that will prevent violence and criminalization, reduce incarceration rates, rehabilitate offenders, and support victims of CAP and other Indigenous communities not otherwise represented by this distinctions-based model. It's really, really important to ensure the need that there's accessibility and equitable resources and supports to bring the voice of those who aren't otherwise being actively included in these discussions. And regardless of geographical location, CAP does represent Indigenous people within the meaning of UNDRIP. And so if Canada is going to implement to the best of its ability the UNDRIP Act and include measures to address injustices, to combat prejudice and eliminate all forms of systemic racism and discrimination, then this model needs to change. And how we are included in the creation of, this Canada's National Indigenous Justice Strategy is one example. How we're included needs to change. One of the other things that, we recently met with the Office of the Correctional Investigator, and in respect to some of the recommendations that that office has put forward, my understanding is that oftentimes many of those recommendations aren't tangibly followed up on, and if so, that these actions aren't appropriately recorded. So another thing that I think Canada needs to do is be more responsive in that. They need to establish a much stronger mechanism in which the Correction Service Canada can be held to account for how they are responding to folks within our provincial or within the federal system anyhow, and that those recommendations need to be seen as critical to really helping to change where we're at. Along with what Canada can do, I guess, as our National Vice Chief has also said, it's important that we also call upon our international community to take note of this crisis and to give us some aid in calling Canada to task on that.
Thank you,
Okay.
President. My next question is for both of our panelists, and I'll start with National Vice Chief Baudin to speak on it, to give President Allard's voice a break at this time. So with such a high rate of Indigenous peoples involved in the justice system, this of course must have extending negative impacts among the family and community members of those involved. I'm hoping for each of you, if you could share your experiences and your insights on how one Indigenous person or multiple Indigenous peoples being involved in the justice system impacts those families and communities. National Vice Chief?
Absolutely, Bradley. I continue to hear directly from families who've been impacted with regards to their partner, their father, well, sometimes even that would be their grandfather or their grandmother. And it's really sad because one of the things that, well, not one, there's so many things that the Correctional Services Canada does that makes no sense to me. Examples of moving you out of your community and placing you in a community thousands of kilometers away. You could be from Manitoba and end up in British Columbia, or BC, end up in Quebec. That's the kind of things that they do. For what reason, I don't understand. I'm getting a pretty good idea, though. I believe that they want to break you. And to break you, you break you with your family, your support. And then what happens is that they tend to give up. The people that are incarcerated, I find, and in speaking with them, is they tend to give up on the whole thing, including their family. So they become isolated, you know, within their own family, their own communities. And then when you're shoved into a facility somewhere where, you know, your brother, your sister, your wife, or when they can't go visit you when you're in, you know, when you're in Winnipeg and you're in, you know, you're in British Columbia. It's crazy, you know, and they do that on purpose. The other thing that balances out is the issue of accountability. And I don't believe I touched on this when I brought this forward, but because of this and become isolated, you end up with, of course, there's mental health issues that are part of that. I'll give you an example of a story of a guy by the name of Curtis McKenzie. He committed suicide 3 years ago now. It'll be 3 years ago coming up at the age of 27. And he was cut off from his supports. He was cut off from his, you know, his family and that. And he had serious mental health issues, but he was only 3 months away of being released again on a Section 810. He literally, the first time that he was in there, because of these, you know, putting him in segregation, he cut off his nose. And the guards gave him the blades, the razor blades, to do that. It was unbelievable. The second time that he was in there under Section 810, he did it again. But this time, all they did was shove him into the infirmary, come out 2 days later, and then he ended up committing suicide in the Saskatchewan pen. And it impacted his family, you know, and also it impacted the inmates that were in there. There, you know, where was the mental health supports for that? None. And they continue to follow these kind of policies that really hurt him and his family. And as of today, I haven't heard much about what happened in terms of that file, whatever happened to him. Where's the investigation? Where's the accountability? Why would guards hand you razor blades? Purposely hand you razor blades knowing that you have mental health issues. Like, I don't understand that. The other issue too is the, and some people are aware of this, that we've been advocating for 2 Indigenous women, Narissa and Odelia Quaisance, who've been in prison since they were in their 20s. 30 years this year that they've been in prison. And for a crime they never committed. And again, look how they're treated. I have an opportunity to participate in a parole board hearing. To see the process is unbelievable. And I was just an observer. I was so frustrated, I wanted to punch the screen, but I couldn't say anything. I just had to listen. And some of the questions that were being asked, there's nobody even on the, participating today would have a hard time answering these questions. So again, you could see the colonial approach, the colonial process of how they do parole hearings. And it just didn't work. So again, we need our people, community people in that, to be involved. They need to somehow be engaged. And Beverly did touch on something. Those reports that come out, and I've read probably the last 5 of them from Dr. Zinger's office. And yeah, they can make all the recommendations they want. Correction Services Canada looks at them, they hem and they haw, and they say, well, okay, we're going to stab at it with a little stick. There hasn't been any dramatic changes in years. So again, a lack of accountability from that perspective. And I think that the Correction Services is such a beast, such a big department, so many working parts and so many people making decisions. And the lack of Indigenous people within that system too is a big hindrance, a big barrier, because they don't understand. When I was talking about parole hearings before, they would bring in an elder. The elder wasn't allowed to say anything. They were just there. Well, you might as well just put up a picture on the wall and say that's your elder for today, because that's kind of what they did. The elders were not allowed to engage. So when you see an Indigenous person struggling with questions or being asked to articulate, how they feel on particular things, and you can see that, and yet the elder's not allowed to intercede or even assist in any way. They're just there. They just sit there. So I don't get it. So there's so much things that happen internally that we're not aware of. It's mind-boggling. And one thing I do want to say too, with CAP, we want to be the #1 advocate organization in the country, period. Because I can honestly tell you with the fact that we are the only organization right now that are addressing these issues. The other organizations, I won't name names, but it's not within their wheelhouse. It's not a whole interest to them. But when you have thousands of Indigenous people that are incarcerated, that's a big problem. And like I said, the number's going to go up. And when's it going to end? When it hits 100? When our budget 3.1 hits 5 billion? Anyways, that's, hopefully I answered your question there, but yeah.
Thank you, National Police Chief, for your insights as well. President Allard, if you'd like to share your insights and experience on how this has impacted the families and communities. President Allard, I believe you're on mute.
Sorry, I was having a coughing fit again for a little while there. But I think our National Vice Chief, he really highlighted, in terms of impact on offenders and families, one of the things that I find is that as that disconnect, when an individual moves to a federal institution or at a place of incarceration, that opportunity to maintain any kind of relationship or to resolve the issues that contributed to that individual getting to that place just come to a standstill. And, we know the importance through restorative justice, the importance of GLADU reports, the importance of bringing and including the family, the victims, any of the folks that have had connection to the offender. It's so critically important to give allowance for all of those individuals to also not only share their experience of this individual, but for there to be a means to communicate the feelings in behind those actions. Where are those traumas from past that have influenced, impacted, and directed their actions? How can those be addressed? How can the emotional impact of the victim involved in whatever incident how can that be validated, recognized by the offender, which in turn then helps to contribute to, you know, an ability for a victim or someone to work through that process in a much more expedient kind of way and mentally and healthy, balanced kind of way. So it's not, I mean, there is a much larger impact. You know, communities, for instance, when we have offenders who are looking to return to their reserve or their home community without having had opportunity to kind of work through or to address or to affirm for those within the community that things are different now, that things you know, have changed, it leaves everybody just feeling that much more anxious and unresolved in terms of, you know, what led them there to begin with.
Absolutely. Thank you, and very well spoken. I do have a few more questions prepared. Again, I'll remind the audience that if they would wish to ask their own questions, there's the Q&A button at the bottom of their pages, or they can wait until the end to raise their hand. But for my next question, National Chief Vice Bowden, you'd mentioned the term political prisoners in your presentation earlier when you spoke about Indigenous inmates. Hope you can share with us why you believe that term, political prisoners, is so important for us to use in these conversations about the justice system for our Indigenous peoples.
Well, one of the things that I use that term, if you take a look at the European Parliament and how they address political prisoners, Canada is one of the countries that does not even use that terminology at all. But when you look at how they lay out in terms of political prisoners in Europe, one of the things that really jumps out is if you target a specific people, a culture of people, Indigenous people fit right into that. So when you look at that, it just jumped out to me right away. Policies that pertain to a particular group of people, again, Indigenous people. Now, Canada won't admit that. Like if you say that to them, they doesn't fit. And I'm not even using that term loosely. You just need to look at the European policy process and what they state as political prisoners, how they, you know, articulate that and how they designate that. And you're like, wow, we fit right in. You know, I would say we check off probably every box. But again, you know, and one thing too that's frustrating is I don't know why some countries look at Canada as a model for justice. You know, I recall a speech by Obama a number of years ago when he was in Parliament. He called Parliament a cathedral of freedom under law. But whose law? You know, the colonial law. He even mentioned, surprisingly, he talked about reconciliation with Indigenous people. This was in June 2018. So this is just before his, you know, he's winding down his presidency. These are the kind of key words. And I thought, well, obviously he doesn't have an understanding of what's really going on in Canada, because if he did, I don't know if he would say that. I mean, I see what they're trying to do. They want to, there's an objective or a goal is what they want to look like, but it's just not happening. So when I say political prisoner, I'm serious about that. Like, is it all about politics? Treaty rights, Section 35 rights, Daniels rights? These are all important elements. Those are all politics. These are, you know, serious issues within the Supreme Court of Canada. So if you can't adhere to some of these things that we've won numerous times in court, then yeah. And one thing too, and one of the guidelines as well, or not guidelines, but boxes you would check off, is a particular group who's overrepresented in the justice system. And that's in Europe as well. So there you go. That's why I say that. And I have no problem with saying that. And I have to explain it just like, as I am doing that today. But yeah, and when we have discussions about that, people kind of see that what I'm talking about. And yeah, just look no further. Just Google it, and you'll see what I'm saying. So yeah, so anyways, I'll stop at that. I'll let Beverly talk a little bit. Hopefully she's not coughing.
Often.
Thank you, National Vice Chief, for sharing. I can certainly appreciate that. It is good to look towards what other justice systems are doing to examine Canada and how we can improve. And using the term political prisoners is very relevant for that context. President Allard, my question for you is we're starting to hear that many Indigenous communities have their own Indigenous customs and practices, like healing lodges is one example I'll provide, that are starting to be recognized and used in the justice system for our Indigenous inmates. What significance and role do you see these traditional customs having in the outcomes for our Indigenous inmates?
Well, I'll share a little bit of a story that was shared with me by one of the chiefs from a reserve just adjacent to Edmonton. And he was at an event speaking to a number of youth and talking about the criminal justice system. And he started off by telling this story about when he was a young man, how he felt disconnected from his family, from his culture, from having a sense of purpose and a place of belonging. So he came across this group that, basically took him in and made him feel accepted for who he was. They gave him a sense of belonging. They recognized his place within the group by giving him his colors, that he had to go through a series of tests and he had to go through a series of what's the word I'm looking for when you have to do something to become a part of something, like these rituals. And so as he spoke about this experience, everybody who was listening to him assumed that he was talking about his induction into a gang, because he talked about having been given his colors, about all the rituals and then he turned to everybody and said, I became a part of a drum group and I became a dancer within my nation. And he talked about it. Really, that's what it's about. It's about that connection to culture, that sense of belonging, that purpose of being. All of these things come to us as Indigenous people through our culture, through our protocols, through our ceremonies, and being given recognition of your value and your place within your community is so critically important. So I thought that was kind of a cool story to share.
Thank you. Certainly appreciate the stories being shared and the positivity that's coming from it. With that, I'd like to continue the positivity train. This is my final question that I have for our panelists. Again, if there's anyone who'd like to prepare their own questions, please do so now, as that opportunity will be available after this question. But today has been a lot of focus primarily on a lot of the issues and the problems that we see within this system. And I'd like to take this opportunity to look more towards the future and towards solutions that might be in place. And one of the common themes that I'd heard between both of our panelists' presentation is this need to decolonize the justice system in Canada as one of the necessary steps we move towards reconciliation. And so my question, beginning with National Vice Chief, is I'm curious to hear from each of you on your vision, your insights, your experience on what a decolonized justice system may look like and how we can begin moving towards that.
I would say number one is that the system itself has to include Indigenous people, period. Community people, people that are working, from a grassroots perspective. For us to have any changes, that's what we need to do. They can't be made up of policy people. People are making $100,000 a year, thinking that they know about Indigenous people when they haven't even took a class, in anything. They weren't even, our education system has failed us so bad in this country that, if you weren't taught about Indigenous people, you wouldn't know, unless you saw them in person, you wouldn't know about anything about them, their history or anything, like where they came from, nothing. And that's the problem right there. But there are solutions. I really believe there are. The other thing too is that Correction Services Canada they have the resources. They certainly have the policies in place. They just haven't implemented them yet. You know, one example is healing plans. Communities need to be involved in healing plans. They need to be involved in restorative justice plans. All those things need to be built in from the community so that person doesn't end up back in the system again. Give them the supports, him or her, the supports that they need so they're not back. Communities can do that. Take away the money from the administrators, the big, instead of the kingdom building. Anyways, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, National Vice Chief. President Allard?
Again, I'll give you another example of something that I think is very positive, but it needs to be set up in areas across this country, not just in an isolated place. But in the city of Calgary, in Alberta here, we have an Indigenous court. And that court, they meet, it's open every Wednesday. So again, it's only limited to the one day. And that needs to be, needs to be enhanced. But it's an Indigenous court and the judges on the bench are individuals who are Indigenous themselves, who have a great deal of experience in the area of restorative justice. There's a huge emphasis placed on Gladue reports and bringing together and sharing information with respect to not only the offender and his or her offense, but the contributing factors that may have led to that or those actions. There's opportunity for community and family members to contribute in the judicial process. So there's a real strong focus on looking at all of those determinants that have brought this individual to this place. There's also an emphasis placed on, should the individual then become incarcerated for a period of time, what supports are going to be provided throughout that, and what is going to be the plan for that individual to transition. So all of these things are discussed up front. And models like that, I think Indigenous-led, need to be instituted in other municipalities throughout our country.
Thank you very much. So with that is the end of my prepared questions that I have. I'd like to thank our two panelists today, our National Vice Chief Beaudin and President Allard, for sharing your insights and experiences. Certainly, I share in each of your visions for what a decolonized justice system looks like in Canada, and I agree with the need for immediate steps to begin addressing and moving towards that vision. At this time, I would like to take just a brief pause to invite any of our participants and attendees. If you'd like to ask your own questions, you may do so through the Q&A button at the bottom of your page, or you may raise your hand. And again, I'll just provide a brief pause now if there are any who are interested. Okay, I certainly appreciate that. When it comes to presentations like this, I often find that when everyone's answers are everyone's questions are answered so sufficiently that it's a lot of information to absorb and sometimes takes time to process. So I think that's a good sign for just the amount of information that was presented today, and I will certainly take that to heart. I have learned much myself, and I think that I'm better equipped to be able to go into my community and share what I've heard today. So with that, I would like to invite at this time our National Chief, Elmer St. Pierre, to provide us with some closing remarks, followed by a closing prayer by our National Elder, Diane Langley. National Chief.
Well, thanks a lot, Bradley. First of all, I'd like to thank our National Chief, Kim Beaudin, and our President from Alberta, Beverly Allard. Great job, people, as well is to our national youth, Bradley. Bradley, over the years, I gotta say this, over the years, Bradley has, he's chaired our meeting at our AGAs. And then just recently, he's chaired our meetings at our side events. And he does a real good job. He keeps things on track. He knows what he's doing. And I want to thank him for that. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today as well. And hopefully we will be able to meet again at a different time and under different circumstances of different views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, National Chief. National Elder, would you like to provide a closing prayer?
There, back alive again. Creator, we give you thanks for your wisdom and guidance as we think about items we have discussed today. May we bring back to the next meeting any ideas to help us continue to try to make a difference. We ask you to let it be so. Tahoe. Walau.
Thank you, National Elder. At this time, I'd like to thank all of our attendees, our panelists, everyone for attending today's event. I hope you enjoy the rest of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I'd also like to provide one more reminder that today is the Red Dress Day in Canada in honor and in recognition of missing Indigenous women and girls. I invite all of our attendees to take a little bit of your time today to honor and reflect upon the roles that many Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited LGBTQIA+ peoples have had in our lives, personally and distantly, and in our past histories. With that, I think that is a good way to end today's discussion. Thank everyone for coming out. Merci, miigwech, and I hope everyone stays safe and healthy. Thank you.